Good evening. Let everyone scurry in here and get their seats. We'll get started. But before we get started, I'll ask Micah to lead us with opening prayer. So we'll get started with that.
Let's bow together. Yahweh, the Almighty God, we are in awe of the creation we see around us, amazed at the work that you've done, recorded in your word, that throughout the ages since this world began, you've been working to redeem us, working to bring us into relationship with you. And I thank you that you've had that mercy, shown us that grace, and that through that we have a family here working to build one another up, to strengthen and encourage one another, to show love one to another, that we can learn more of you and demonstrate that light to the world around us. Please bless us as we've gathered together, as we delve into your word to think more like you, and bless John and his leading of us. We pray this now in Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Micah. So tonight we are going to be talking about America's favorite pastime, rebellion. I mean, who doesn't love a good underdog story? You know, from Seabiscuit to Star Wars, it's all about the rebels, the underdog, the small person coming up against the big person. Unfortunately, our culture tends to be biased in the wrong direction as far as that goes. And that's going to be what I'm going to focus on tonight, is how are we looking at this? How are we looking at Korah, especially? And forgive me if I mispronounce or slip of the tongue and say Kohath. You'll understand later, but forgive me if I do that. So focusing on Korah, I want to focus on why he did this, his mindset, and his motives as best we can. It's always speculation, and unfortunately there's not a lot to go on, but let's try to focus on that so that we don't end up in the same place, since we as a culture tend to err on the side of rebellion versus obedience most of the time. So first of all, I want to ask you a question. What is Korah's rebellion? Can you give me 2-3 sentences of your guys' homework? Don't everyone raise their hands at once now. I know it's cold out there, but let's warm up and move your arms a bit. You can do it by raising them up, and I'll call on you.
Just the idea that he wanted to do something different than Aaron and Moses. In its most simplest.
Yep. So he wanted to do something different. Anyone else get any other key concepts from this?
He and his group that he got together, about, I think 250,
Yeah, it wasn't just him. He got his buddies together.
went face to face against Moses and Aaron.
Yeah, and this wasn't just talking behind his back. They went right up to his face. You're right. A very, I don't know what the word I want to use is, but I guess in your face is the easiest way to describe it. Anyone else? All right. Well, let me ask you this now. We've had a few lessons, and we've got a few more going. What is different about this compared to the others? Is there anything that sets this one out compared to those? Compared to the flood, compared to Abraham sacrificing or almost sacrificing Isaac, or even the 10 plagues? Any differences? Anything that really shouts out to you compared from this to that? Or any of the other ones if you read ahead?
Not a lot of children's songs about this one.
You're right. Can't pull up a children's song like I think a few other people have. But it's not exactly a child-friendly topic, yeah.
This one is not in the 2- and 3-year-old curriculum.
Yeah. Was that a hand? No.
So far, anyway, this one is a much more focused on God's people and rebellion within God's people, as opposed to rebellion seen from without or explicit following God's lead.
And this isn't a struggle between the ones that follow God and the ones outside his people. This is even an internal struggle like with Abraham. This is a struggle between what should have been two people or two groups of people wanting to follow God and serve God. Any other comments?
I might be wrong about this, but I don't see some very clear expression of faith on the part of Korah.
No, a clear expression of faith. It's hard to say for, yeah. It's hard to say for sure since we don't really have a lot on it, but we'll dig a little bit deeper into that later, yeah. Any other comments? All right. And the one comment that I really jumped out at me is it's only 2 little chapters. So we're going to dig deep, so don't be nervous or scared to get into the nitty-gritty with this. We don't have to cover years or major events like the flood. Why did that skip forward so much? Do you know why that's skipping forward more than one slide? All right. Technical difficulties. So while he's fixing that, who was Korah? Who was he? What do we know about him? What tribe did he belong to? Oh, sorry, did someone speak up? He was a popular leader, yeah. He wasn't just a nobody from nowhere. All right, popped up there. And so Korah, we know, wasn't just a nobody from nowhere. He was actually a cousin of Moses and Aaron. He was, if it wasn't for Moses coming back and delivering the people, probably going to be at the same level hierarchically with them. Thought of the same way, a great-grandson of Levi. All right. He was part of the tribe of the Kohathites, and that's why I might mix up the two, so forgive me. These were the tribe of Levi, the clan of the Kohathites, 86,000 men. This is right after leaving Egypt with the census that they had there. 8,600 men, 1 month and older. The 4 clans, Amram was the one that Moses and Aaron was under. That was their father. And Izhar was Korah's father. And the leader of the Kohathites was Elipsephan, son of Uzziel. And so, unfortunately, for Korah anyway, he wasn't even the leader of the Kohathites. It was this guy, their cousin. And so he didn't even have that under his name. They camped on the south side of the tabernacle, the same side as the camp of the Reubenites, which makes sense. We'll see here in a minute. Now this isn't working. There we go. Their main duties were to carry the most holy things. So of all the Levites, besides Aaron and his lineage, they probably had the most auspicious job. They were to carry the ark, the lampstand, the articles of the sanctuary, the table, altars, the gold and the bronze, and the curtain. The thing is, though, is they couldn't even see, let alone touch them. Whenever they walked around, they would have to have a blue carpet or fabric or whatever kind of material that is, covering all those ornaments. They would camp here. See if I can get the laser pointer to work. Perfect. Kohath, right next to Simeon, Reuben, and Gad's camp. And so you can also see down here, Reuben's in the center, I think, on that one. And so they were camped all there together since it was Korah and a few Reubenites that were basically the ones that were in charge of this rebellion. But what happened before this? From last Sunday's lesson, we went from the plagues of Egypt. So what has happened between then and now? What events has happened? Does anyone remember anything from the first portion of their wanderings to this point? Can anyone think of even one thing that may have happened?
A couple things. In Numbers 12, it's interesting the close relationship to Moses, Miriam, and Aaron were speaking against. Has God spoken to you only? Has he not spoken to us as well? And so you get that challenge of authority. I think that's also kind of related to Korah. He's challenging who's really in charge here.
Mm-hmm. He's not the first one to speak up against Moses. His own brother and sister beat him to it. And so that's definitely a big thing that happened. Can anyone else think of anything else that happened?
The covenant was given.
The covenant, the whole year and some at Mount Sinai with all the events that took place there. The establishment of all these laws, the same laws that Korah wanted to rebel against. Any other events that you can think of? Well, we'll go through them. So first, starting off where John did, the Exodus from Egypt. So we got the 10 plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea. Then we got gathering of manna and quails, Moses striking the rock at Rephidim for water, Israel being attacked by the Amalekites at Rephidim as well. Then at Mount Sinai, God speaking to Israel and Moses through the fire, the smoke, the quakes, the lightning and thunder, and then the elders worshiping at the distance with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. Then we have Aaron's big blunder with the golden calf, where the Levites had to gather together and 3,000 people of Israel were slain. Moses then brings down the 10 Commandments, and his face shone, and a covenant was made with Israel, and the tabernacle built, and Moses serving at the tent of meeting with the Lord, and then the deaths of Nadab and Abihu. And all of this occurred just over a year at Sinai, and the travels beforehand. And then after that, we have Taberah, where the fire of the Lord blazed and killed those that complained in the hearing of the Lord in the outskirts of the camp. So judgment from the God. Then we have Israel complaining about the lack of meat and the variety of food, weeping at the entrance of their tents. A plague kills those that craved meat. But also, we have the 70 elders given a portion of the Spirit that was placed upon Moses. We then have Aaron and Miriam speaking out against Moses, and Miriam was lepers for 7 days. And then the 12 spies are sent out. Israel is then cursed to wander for 40 years for disobeying, and the 10 spies were killed. Israel then rebelled and went to fight. They decided they wanted to go up anyway, and they were defeated. And then, small little thing it seems, but a Sabbath breaker was stoned to death in Kadesh. And that's where we find ourselves now, is Kadesh. Or at least it seems to be. Rebels, we have Korah, son of Izhar, the Reubenites, Dathan, Abiram, sons of Eliab, and then we also have On, son of Peleth, and then 250 men of Israel. And they were leaders of the congregation, representatives in the assembly. These were not no names, as we said before. So what were the main complaints? What did the rebels complain about? We only have a few sentences from them. Korah, in number 16:3, says, "You have taken too much upon yourselves, for everyone in the entire congregation is holy, and the Lord is in their midst. Why then do you exalt yourselves above this assembly of the Lord?" And then the Reubenites say, after Moses sent for them, "We will not come. Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? Must you also appoint yourself as ruler over us? Moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, or given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you gouge out the eyes of these men? No, we will not come." So these are the main two complaints that we have. What can we learn from these? What is their main motivations, it seems? What for Korah and what for the Reubenites?
Beforehand, they were complaining about the leadership and the direction that they're taking the group, questioning that leadership as to whether you actually have our best interests at heart.
Yeah. So they're questioning Moses greatly. I mean, think about all they've been through till now. They were promised a land flowing of milk and honey, and the latest biggest thing is they're not going to get it for another 40 years, and them especially are not. Why do you think Korah said, "For everyone in the entire congregation is holy, and the Lord is in their midst"? What events would have led him to think that? Do you think it's just simple, everyone is good, everyone is great, you're thinking too highly of yourself, you're no better than us? Or is there reasons, events that may have happened in the past that could have led to that?
Well, I mean, he's experienced basically everything from the Exodus up until now, so he's seen God deliver him from the Egyptian slavery or Egyptian bondage. He's seen them be delivered through the Red Sea or the Reed Sea or whatnot. You know, he's seen all this happen, and it would be hard. I think if that happened to us today, it would be hard not to go, "Wow, it must be really cool, or really good, or holy," because God's taken such an interest in us. He's saved us specifically from these bad things. So I look at that and I
Yeah, these people had lived through all these miraculous events, chosen by God, told that they are God's holy people. It's hard not to think that you're holy when you're told that you are God's holy people. Can you think of anything else? And these might be small things. I know I had to look for them. But one thing I did just mention a slide or two ago. The 70 elders just had the same spirit that Moses had placed on them. And then there's this one line that's told to Moses at Sinai before Aaron does this whole golden calf routine. We assume, or at least I assume, that Moses probably told those words to the congregation since they are written down in the book. But they were told that they would be a holy priesthood, a nation of priests. That was then rescinded after the whole golden calf thing, it seems, where now Aaron and his lineage are going to be the priests. But initially, that was part of what was going on. Could it be that Korah is wanting to grasp onto that? He wasn't part of that, maybe. He was probably one of the Levites, or at least supported one of the Levites that came against those people after Moses came back down. Doesn't seem so unreasonable to think that, hey, I wasn't one of the guys being punished. Why should I now not get the priesthood? And what about the Reubenites? Why would the Reubenites be saying all this? What is their main motivation?
One thing could be just their impatience, that you said this was gonna happen and now it's not happening, so, but they're not looking at the reasons why they're not moving into the land either. So short-sighted, impatient, good Americans, maybe.
Yeah. And so their main complaint is, we were promised a land. We were promised a land, and we expected it when we left Egypt. I don't see no land, Moses. You can't gouge out my eyes. I don't see a land. And yet, they weren't paying attention to the reasons why they weren't in the land. All they were focusing on was, it's not here now. Back in Egypt was better than here, or at least so it seemed to them at the time. And one thing that really jumped out at me was that they don't seem to be complaining about the same thing. It doesn't seem that Korah or the Reubenites were on the same page. It seems to be more that this was just a combination of convenience. So they just were camped next to each other. Okay.
I don't disagree with that. However, I do think there's this common theme of Moses putting himself over as a leader, as opposed to recognizing God for Moses as a leader.
Exactly. That is one thing that does link them, yeah.
Both have that sort of same flavor.
Yeah. So while their goals probably weren't the same, their problems were. That's a very good point. Sorry, go ahead.
I think another thing that may play into the Reubenites' attitude is that Reuben was the oldest son, and he should have been the son of the heir of promise, and should have gotten a double portion. Of course, the first three sons were Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, and all three of them did things to embarrass and be an affront to Jacob. And so that's why the promise ends up going through Judah, the fourth son. But they're from the tribe of the oldest son of all the sons of Jacob. And so there's probably some attitude of, we're in a special place because of, Reuben being the oldest son. Amen.
Yeah. I mean, they're the great-grandsons. It wasn't that long ago when Reuben, Levi, and all of them were alive for them. They could probably remember these people. I mean, we know Joseph lived to see his great-great-grandson, or maybe even just great-grandson, but still, wouldn't be too unheard of for that Levi and Reuben to do the same. Any other comments before I go on?
I mean, they're certainly pulling out certain pieces of truth, but they're pulling out the pieces of truth that are supporting what they want to say and conveniently leaving out the pieces of truth that would balance that out and say, no, you're wrong.
Exactly. They're looking at it from what would benefit them the most, what they want. They're only looking or at least only seeing what they want to see, kind of like what Andy mentioned. They're not looking at this from God's point of view. They're seeing Moses as their leader, not God, and they're seeing him as the problem of all these things. Any other comments?
It just seems like they ascribe a harsher mentality to Moses and his messengers here. Will you gouge out the eyes of these men? Is that something Moses had threatened to do? I don't think so. God had some harsh punishments for them, but like you said, they were looking at Moses for some reason and just kind of getting Moses wrong.
Yeah. I mean, they just had a man stoned for, I think it was gathering wood, but I can't recall for sure. But he was doing work on the Sabbath just before this, it seems. And they were blaming Moses for that, perhaps. Perhaps that's why they thought he would do something, since he's the one that said, must be stoned. But yeah, they do have a very harsh view of Moses.
If I recall right, it seems that they want to give Moses all of the responsibility and blame of a leader without giving him the authority of a leader, because they're solely pinning the wilderness experience on Moses, and so they're giving him that responsibility, and yet they won't let him lead.
Yeah.
You can't do both.
Yeah, they're putting all the negatives on him, but giving him none of his due. And perhaps that's what they thought. They thought Moses, the reason why nothing's perfect, because God can't be imperfect. It must be Moses' fault that all this stuff isn't working out right, because he's the man, he's the imperfect one. So in short, Moses was taking too much upon himself. Moses was no longer supposed to be the leader. The entire congregation is holy. But the one thing I want to point out, especially for Korah, is he agrees to appeal to the Lord. Moses set a challenge and said, hey, let's both do this and let God decide. So it doesn't seem to me that he had no thought towards God. He just didn't have the correct thought towards God. He was okay to let God decide, and either he was completely just dumb to think that all this stuff was just Moses' magical powers, or that God wasn't a true person or understood entity where he could make a choice. But I can't fathom anything else other than that he was okay to appeal to God and had some notion of what that meant.
I'm sorry if somebody commented and I missed it, but going back to motivation, why did they want to rebel? Could it be that not only were they impatient in entering the promised land in the first place, but the incident with the spy event, God said, you're not coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Period. You're going to die here. And they're complaining that, hey, you're leading us out here to die. And yeah. You're going to die. And it's going to be your children that are going to go into the promised land.
And maybe not even their children with how old they were. Their great-grandchildren may have been the only ones that were under 20. You're right.
And they didn't like Moses' answer, not realizing that was God's answer.
Yeah, I mean, assuming they have a similar age to Moses, at least Korah, he was probably at least 80s or 90s by now. Yeah, these were not young men. They didn't have much time left, or they may not have seen him that way. They were impatient.
We are kind of projecting concepts and whatnot too, tying into several of the concepts that have gone on, and specifically with him saying you're taking on too much, or you're exalting yourself too much. He may have been under the belief that a lot of what was being done and a lot of the obedience that was coming through was people being afraid of, and maybe even personally feeling this himself, afraid of Moses, and not thinking that maybe Moses was the exalting himself, was Moses making these claims, Moses bargaining on them being fearful of him and what he could do, and thinking that maybe it wasn't so much God actually working through Moses, but Moses claiming it was and just kind of doing whatever he felt like doing, and therefore agreeing to this appeal would be, okay, well, see now God's going to step in and say, yeah, you're not supposed to be doing that. Let's balance this out a little bit.
Exactly. It's a lot. I probably won't repeat it correctly, so I'm sorry for those listening at home. But yeah, and the last thing that happened before this was a person was stoned. I believe it was a woman and an Egyptian son, but I could be wrong on that. But basically, it was a man that was killed at Moses' command for breaking the Sabbath. And that may have been the last straw, since that wasn't God killing them. It wasn't God like with the fire. It wasn't God like with the plagues. This was Moses saying, he did this, stone him. Mm-hmm.
And it does say the Lord said unto Moses, chapter 15, thank you, chapter 15. It does say the Lord said unto Moses, surely this is what you should do.
Yeah.
Tell this man.
Yeah, God told Moses, but they couldn't hear anything other than thunder. So from there, yeah, you're correct.
That's all right.
But from their point of view, it wasn't a miraculous event killing this man. It was Moses relaying the words of God. Thank you for that correction. I want to misspeak in that, but yeah. But it wasn't a miraculous event. It was their own hands at Moses' command. He was relaying this from God, but from their point of view, they may not have thought that. They may have begun to doubt that Moses was correct at this point in time, since they still evidently trusted God by appealing to him. But thank you for bringing that up. What was the verse of that again, so everyone can...
It's Numbers 15, verse 34, 35, and 36, primarily 35.
Numbers 15, primarily 35. Right, thank you. All right. So let's see how Korah saw things. So, Exodus from Egypt. Well, Moses, because he went to Pharaoh, now Israel has to gather their own straw for their bricks. Egypt or Pharaoh increased their labor because of Moses. That may be how he looked at things. And then Moses led them into a basic dead end where God had to save them, thankfully. But maybe that's how they were looking at this. I want us to try and see how we can look at these things, these events, not at the correct way, but how a self-serving person may look at these, like Korah, so that we now do not accidentally find ourselves falling into the same trap that Korah did, as Jude 11 warns. So how about the manna and the quail? How could that be twisted to look bad for Moses? How should we not look at that kind of event where God gave manna and God gave quail for them to eat because they wanted food?
I kind of like the buffet model, where you have a full choice of many different varieties of food types.
Mhm.
Eating the same thing day in and day out, leftovers, that's not really up to my style. So,
Yeah.
and this is all that Moses and Aaron are giving us.
I mean, I enjoy honey. I mean, I make my own as best I can, but I wouldn't want to eat it every day. And that's evidently what manna tasted like, honey wafers or something like that, I think it's described. You hear them later complain, where are our roots? Where are our leeks? These weren't kids complaining about that. I've never heard a kid complain about, where are my vegetables? And so, yeah, where is my green food? Where's my other stuff? I don't want just this day in and day out. I want variety. All right, and then what about the rock at Rephidim, where Moses struck it for water? I know we're pulling into, long ago studies of this probably. If you haven't read it recently, you may not recognize it. But what happened before he struck the rock? Or around the same time, I may not give an exact connection. But what do they say that Israel almost did to Moses at this point? Well, they almost stoned him. So Moses only gave us water after we got so upset with him we threatened to stone him. And what about the attack of Amalek at Rephidim as well? Do you remember how they won the battle? Moses had to hold up his arms, and as long as his arms were up, they won. But he couldn't even do that. He had to have two people come by and hold up his arms, and they had to get a rock so he could sit on it. I mean, we needed him, and he couldn't even do this. These are some ways that we can definitely fall into the same traps of thinking the wrong thing. What about Mount Sinai and God speaking to Israel and then Moses? So Moses told them that Israel would be a kingdom of priests. Thankfully, I wrote the verse down there, Exodus 19:6. The elders go up, but they don't go up all the way. And the congregation says, no, we don't want to go up. So it's their own fault there, but they probably don't remember that. They don't remember their choices in this. They just remember the results potentially. But that's probably why Korah thought that the entire congregation was holy, because that was originally what they were going to get until they did the wrong thing. And they kept doing the wrong thing, and God kept reducing what he was going to give them. And then we have Aaron, second in command, basically, chief of the priests. And he's the one that makes a golden calf. Doesn't matter if Israel demanded it, the whole congregation, But he's the one that did it. And who had to clean up that mess but the Levites? Most likely Korah, or at least some of his group. They had to clean up Aaron's mess. Then kill their own brothers as well. They had to kill their own tribesmen, 3,000 people. And then Nadab and Abihu, the same people that are in charge, God even rejects. Look at that. He killed them. He killed them with fire. And Taberah, the Lord sends fire to kill many of Israelites for the complaining. That is probably Moses' fault somehow, but it's hard to connect it, at least from their point of view. Moses finally gets something besides quail, and oh, look, it kills, or something for meat, and oh, look, it kills all the Israelites that wanted to eat it. And God must be unhappy with him because he's given a portion of the Spirit to the elders. Moses isn't the only one in charge now, the only one with the Spirit. God must be unhappy with them because he's taking it and giving it to others. Doesn't matter if Moses was happy for this. Moses said if only all of Israel could have this Spirit. And then Hazeroth, Aaron, and Moses finally speak up. So even his own brother and sister can't stand him. They know that he's not a good leader. Doesn't matter if Miriam was later punished for this. And basically, the wilderness of Paran, now they can't get into the promised land. The last straw. And Moses wouldn't even go up with him. He wouldn't even try to appeal this. He wouldn't go up and fight with them, so they were defeated. So Korah's point of view was not looking at things from God's point of view. They were not looking at, Korah and the other Reubenites were not looking at things the way they should be. They felt betrayed, and they weren't. They did not look at themselves, but they were looking at everyone else. Moses and Aaron didn't exalt themselves. They didn't raise themselves up. And in fact, you remember Moses saying, no. I think it was 4 times he said, you got the wrong guy, God. They didn't want this, or at least it doesn't seem to be. They didn't elevate themselves for sure. It was God. And that's the thing that Korah and the Reubenites did not see. And unfortunately for them, this was God's result, God's response to them. So while God told, go ahead.
No, before you got too much farther away, I always thought it was really interesting, verse 4 of chapter 16, that after this accusation made against Moses, the first thing he does is fall on his face. And I think that's because he knows maybe not exactly what's going to happen, but he knows he didn't exalt himself.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that they are coming against who God exalted. And so I think that reaction is for their benefit, not necessarily just his own, if that makes sense.
Yeah, he seems to be thinking of them. A little bit further down, he seems to be almost compelling them, say, hey, don't do this. I mean, it's described, I forget what the verse, but Moses as the most humble of men. He was not one to stand up, and frequently he did this whenever somebody came against him. He fell on his face because he knew that they were not coming against him, but against God. Great point, thank you. Any other points before we go beyond this? Because this is more or less the end of the current events. Does he see a hand? No? All right. So we know that God spoke with Moses. He then went to the Reubenites and told the entire congregation to separate from them. A point there is the word in Hebrew for dwelling. I forget the verse because it actually has both. But when it mentions Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, it actually is the same word used for tabernacle and is a singular word, not a plural word. So it's potential, not for sure, but potential. They may have even set up a separate tabernacle. Or it may have been just a big tent where they met. We don't know. But it seems to be a singular place that is designated as all 3 of them. Another thing of note is who's missing? Who of the rebels aren't mentioned later on when the punishment's being dealt out? We have the earth swallowing Dathan and Abiram and Korah, of course. Who's missing? Do you remember one of the rebels that was not mentioned there? On, thank you. We don't know why he's not mentioned, but perhaps he did listen to Moses' plea saying, don't do this. And that might be why he's not mentioned with that. I think Jewish lore says that it was his wife that convinced him, but for some reason, he's not mentioned in the punishments. But what happened after this? Have you ever heard of Korah's name besides this section of Numbers? What about in some of these verses? It's not Korah himself, but Korah's line. So while the Reubenites, Dathan and Abiram, seem to have perished with all their family, Korah's line didn't, or at least it seems to be. We assume it's the same Korah. But by the end of the Exodus, they're one of the big clans. I believe that's the Numbers 26 verse there. They're mentioned as taking their duties of the tabernacle in Chronicles. I believe that's closer to David's time. And even some of those psalms were written by them. And so from those psalms and from their continued function at the tabernacle, they learned from Korah's mistake. And I hope that we today can learn from that as well. Some of the things that were mentioned of them are these verses here. They had hardships, as those verses of Psalms 88 and 44 said. Yet, Psalms 45, I will make your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore the people shall praise you forever and ever. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000, and I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wickedness. I can't help but think of the rebellion in that verse there. So what are some things that we can learn from Korah's rebellion? I've just mentioned a few things here, and I'd love to talk about them, but first I want to know what you can think of. Are there anything else that you can think of that we can learn from this? About thinking as we shouldn't so that we can think as we should.
By no means was their experience easy. I mean, I can relate to a lot of their complaints and their worries and their concerns. It was not easy, but one thing I see them doing is looking at everybody except themselves. So Moses is the focus of all the blame, as opposed to them looking and saying, what did I do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a natural reaction sometimes when there's friction is, you're the problem. And I find all the reasons why you're the problem, and it's really hard for me to look and see what I'm doing that's actually causing the problem, or at least proliferating.
Exactly. They weren't looking at things as what they could do to help. I can remember somebody else that said Moses had taken on too much, his father-in-law, but he actually came at it from a helpful point of view. Imagine if Korah had done the same. Is there a hand over there?
That list, when you said they weren't looking at things accurately, whenever we're looking through that, what caught my attention was a lack of gratitude, a lack of appreciation. Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5 says, in everything, give thanks. So even if I've only got bread and quail, God is giving it to me today, and I am thankful.
Yeah. Regardless of what we have, especially when you don't have to buy a new pair of shoes for 40 years. I mean, that's great. I mean, I think mine are, what, a year old? Now they're like $100 or more. Tell you what.
I think it's challenging for us as human beings to really understand that just because we see things with our eyes doesn't mean we know everything about a topic, a situation, a circumstance. And so when we don't know everything, if we can let ourselves get into that situation, then we can be willing to give folks the benefit of the doubt. So I think about this still within the church and within the eldership in the church. We're not going to ever know everything that's going on. So in some instances, with your own faith, giving them the benefit of the doubt that they're trying to do the best they can as they understand. And I think that's the same thing it is with Moses and Aaron.
Yes, great. We need to be making sure that we are not thinking the worst of them, but giving them an understanding of what pressures are on them. Yeah, great. Mark, then Scott.
Jump to a little bit wider range there and looking at some of the additional context around what led up to this particular statement. And one of the things that jumps out at me with that is the idea of trying to define what I think my life should look like, as opposed to allowing God to give that direction and following his lead. I'm not talking about don't set
Exactly. Do we really think about what we're saying when we end a prayer? If it be your will, so be it. Amen. And we need to think about that. Scott? Pass? All right. Anyone want to catch that? No? Fumble. All right. And so, since we don't have a ton of time, basically, we'll go ahead and we'll look at the aftermath instead of digging into these. But this rebellion caused a lot of problems. It didn't just end when the 250 rebels and the few Reubenites with the two men of Reuben died. For one, we had those bronze censers hammered onto the altar as a sign. But Israel continued to grumble. You have killed the Lord's people. They still are doing the same thing that it seems Korah and the Reubenites were doing. They were blaming the bad on Moses and not seeing it as God's will, which is surprising considering I don't know how Moses could have caused fire to come out. But he must have done it with Nadab and Abihu, so he should have, probably did it again. But don't know how they thought that he was solely responsible for the earth swallowing the Reubenites, especially just so. But it's an eye problem. It's a heart problem. So the Lord sends a plague on the congregation, and not just the 250 men die, but over 14,000. This was a problem that was rampant in Israel at the time. We see this because of all the complaints and the wandering. We see this because of all the punishment and the sheer 40 years of it. And ironically, the ones that they were blaming for it put a stop to it. Aaron rushes out and halts this plague. Then God then has to set it up so that Aaron is for sure not going to be challenged again. Yet even after that, Israel still declares, we are perishing, we are lost. Anyone who come near the tabernacle of the Lord will die. Are we all going to perish? We need to make sure that we learn this lesson. We need to make sure that we work well with each other, that we see things from God's point of view, from a loving point of view, realizing that if we think there might be something that needs to be done differently, maybe we should try to help, not try to say, hey, you're not doing a good job, let me take a quack at this, or a whack at this. Sorry, I'm not a duck. But yeah, so we need to just focus on how we can do help, how we can love, how we can be there for each other. We got about a minute or two left. Are there any last minute thoughts or comments about all this?
To me, it's amazing, and I'm not sure how to make application of that today, but that, if with the earth opening up and swallowing up Korah and his men, and that's attributed to Moses, maybe they perceive Moses as being God, and maybe some of them in some sense.
Good point, yeah.
But if that's, they say that he's the one who did it, but if that's the case, then this is a powerful person. Why would I not submit to him as opposed to continuing to grumble against him?
Mm-hmm.
If this is done by miraculous means, we should be submissive to it. I guess the lesson for today is that we have miracles throughout all the Bible, and they're not explained away by natural circumstances. And what is our attitude?
Mm-hmm.
Do we recognize that as acts of God, and that he actually is a benevolent God that has our best interests at heart, so we should submit, or do we just continue to rebel in the face of that kind of evidence?
Yeah, and it just occurred to me when you mentioned that, they had just come from Egypt, and where the priests were repeating some of these miracles, or at least so it seemed. And just as they claimed Jesus did when he went down to Egypt as a child, that he took some of Egyptian sorcery powers, and that's how they explained it away in like the 2nd and 3rd century, which is of course ridiculous. But maybe they thought the same way. Maybe they thought that Moses had some magical power, sorcery power, since he did grow up in Pharaoh's palace. Maybe he studied with the priests.
I had never thought till you reviewed sort of the history that it also really impresses on me how much fear plays a part in what we see and what we understand, because they were told, you are not going to the promised land, you're all going to die. And it looks like they're looking for any other alternative.
Yeah.
And so if removing Moses, maybe that changes it. So again, it just seems
fear is a big driver.
That is a good point, yeah. The fear is fearful. It's horrible. Animal in the corner kind of reaction, it seems. Yeah, very good point. Any other points? Any other comments?
It's amazing how much damage is done when we go against God's will.
Exactly, yeah. 250 people in some caused the deaths of over 14,000 people because of their actions. All right, thank you. It's a great class.